The sun was barely over the horizon when the first patrol car rolled down the long gravel drive of the old Hawkins ranch. I was out by the barn, coffee in hand, watching my horses graze on 200 acres that had belonged to my family since my grandfather staked his claim back in 1923. 3 deputies stepped out, hats low, hands resting near their belts. The lead officer cleared his throat and informed me that I had 30 days to vacate the property. The land, he said, belonged to the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I laughed at first, couldn't help it. I'd lived here my whole life, paid taxes on every square foot, and never once heard of Willowbrook Estates laying claim to anything beyond the tidy cul-de-sac 2 miles down the county road. But the officer wasn't smiling. He handed me a thick envelope stamped with the HOA seal and a temporary restraining order signed by a judge I'd never met. At the top of the first page, in bold letters, was the name Jennifer Blackwood, President, Willowbrook Estates HOA. That was the day everything changed. My name is Gerald Hawkins. I spent 35 years as a petroleum engineer, chasing oil across 3 continents before coming home to retire on the ranch. I figured my biggest worries would be coyotes and the occasional broken fence. Instead, I found myself staring down a woman who seemed determined to take everything my family had built. Jennifer Blackwood lived in one of those oversized houses at the entrance of the new development. White columns, manicured lawn, a 3-car garage that probably cost more than my first house. She was polished, always dressed like she was heading to a boardroom, and she spoke with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. When she first approached me a year earlier, it was all smiles. She wanted to welcome me to the community, suggested I might enjoy the pool and clubhouse if I paid the annual assessment. I politely explained that my ranch wasn't part of her subdivision. She nodded, said she understood, and left. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. A few months later, certified letters started arriving. Notices of violation for unapproved structures. Fines for livestock within community boundaries. Then came the surveyors, 3 men in bright vests walking my property line with Jennifer trailing behind them like a general inspecting conquered territory. When I asked what they were doing, she smiled that same practice smile and told me they were simply verifying the master plat. She produced a thick document, complete with seals and signatures, showing that my entire ranch had once been part of the original Willowbrook parcel, illegally severed in the 1980s by my father. I knew that wasn't true. My father had inherited the land fair and square, and every deed in the county courthouse backed it up. But Jennifer's document looked real. Too real. That's when I called Jake Morrison, an old friend from my drilling days who'd gone to law school after the oil bust. Jake took one look at the papers and told me to sit tight. Something wasn't adding up. While Jake dug into the records, Jennifer escalated. She convinced a judge, someone she'd apparently donated heavily to during his last campaign, to grant that temporary restraining order. No hearings, no notice to me, just a signature and a sheriff's deputy at my door. Then came the accusations. Anonymous calls to Child Protective Services claiming my grandchildren were in danger living on unpermitted property. Reports to the county about illegal dumping. Photos of old oil drums that had never been on my land until suddenly they were. I started fighting back quietly. Jake and I spent nights in the courthouse basement pulling microfiche records. We found the original homestead filing from 1923, yellowed but intact, proving the ranch had never been part of any development parcel. We found the subdivision plat for Willowbrook Estates, clearly showing my property as excluded. But every time we presented evidence, Jennifer had a new document, a new witness, a new claim. That's when I noticed the money. Every month, 340 families in Willowbrook Estates received an invoice from the HOA, landscaping, security patrols, community events, reserve funds. Thousands of dollars per household. I started asking questions. Did anyone ever see the security patrols? Had the clubhouse been renovated like the budget claimed? Where were the new playgrounds and walking trails promised year after year? The answers were always vague. It's in progress. The board is reviewing bids. Funds are being held in reserve, but the fees kept going up. One evening, a neighbor, an accountant named Tom Riley, knocked on my door after dark. He was nervous, kept checking over his shoulder. He told me he'd been on the HOA finance committee until he started asking too many questions. Jennifer had removed him, claimed he was disruptive, but before he left, he'd copied some records. Bank statements, wire transfers, payments to companies that didn't seem to exist. Tom handed me a flash drive and said, "Be careful, Gerald. She's not just greedy. She's desperate." Jake and I spent a week going through the files. The numbers were staggering. Over 12 years, nearly $3 million collected, and almost none of it spent on the community. Money routed through shell companies, offshore accounts, personal expenses disguised as consulting fees. Jennifer wasn't just trying to take my land. She was running a long con, and my ranch was the perfect distraction. If she could force me off the property, subdivide it, and sell lots to new buyers, she'd cover the holes in her books before anyone noticed. But we noticed. Jake made a call, not to the county, not to the state attorney general, but to someone he knew in the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. A week later, Special Agent Maria Santos showed up at my kitchen table, quiet and professional, asking questions that made it clear she already knew most of the answers. The investigation moved fast after that. Subpoenas, interviews, frozen accounts. Jennifer panicked. First, she tried to bribe a clerk at the recorder's office to correct some old filings. The clerk recorded the conversation. Then she approached Jake with an offer. $200,000 cash if he'd convince me to drop everything and sell. Jake wore a wire. Her final move was the most unhinged. She filed a report claiming I'd threatened her children. Detailed, specific threats that never happened. She even submitted doctored security footage showing a figure in a hat and coat near her backyard. The figure looked nothing like me, but the police took it seriously enough to question me again. That's when the annual HOA meeting rolled around. The community center was packed. 340 families. Angry, confused, tired of rising fees and broken promises. Jennifer took the stage in a navy blazer, hair perfect, voice steady. She opened with her usual speech about community pride and fiscal responsibility. Then she turned to me, invited me to the microphone as a concerned neighbor to share my perspective. I hadn't planned to speak, but I walked up anyway. I started slow, asked simple questions. When was the last time anyone saw a security patrol? Who had used the clubhouse in the past year? Why were reserve funds at historic lows despite record collections? The room shifted. Murmurs became questions. Questions became demands. Jennifer tried to cut me off, but the crowd wouldn't let her. Someone shouted for the financial reports. Another demanded to see the contracts for the landscaping services that cost $180,000 a year. Jennifer's composure cracked. She raised her voice, accused me of harassment, of spreading lies. That's when Agent Santos stood up from the back row, quiet, calm, badge visible, and asked if Ms. Blackwood would mind answering a few questions downtown. The room went silent. Jennifer looked around for support, but her board members wouldn't meet her eyes. Tom Riley stood and said he'd already spoken to the FBI. Others followed. Years of frustration, of feeling powerless, poured out all at once. Jennifer tried to leave. 2 agents met her at the door. She was arrested that night. Wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, forgery, bribery, the list went on. The judge denied bail. The fake documents, the altered footage, the threats, all of it collapsed under scrutiny. A month later, the residents held a special election. They asked if I'd serve as interim president until proper governance could be restored. I said yes. Not because I wanted power, but because someone had to help clean up the mess. We dissolved the old HOA, formed a new one with transparent books and real oversight. The embezzled funds, what could be recovered, went back to the families. Charges were dropped against me. The restraining order vanished. My ranch stayed mine. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit on the porch and watch the sun set over land my grandfather worked with his own hands. I think about Jennifer, how absolute power, even in a little subdivision, can corrupt absolutely. And I think about how one person asking questions, refusing to back down, can change everything. The deputies never came back. The surveyors packed up and left. The gates of Willowbrook Estates stay open now, and folks wave when they drive past. The ranch is quiet again, and it's still mine,